Good morning, everyone. My name is Keisha Austin, and I'm with the Communications Branch of the Executive Council Office. Thank you for joining us today. This is a technical briefing on the heap leach facility failure that occurred at the Eagle Gold Mine on June 24, 2024. Our aim is to give you an update on what's new since our last briefing. Today, we will focus on off-site environmental testing. Should you have any questions outside of the scope of this topic, please contact Holly Dalrymple with the Department of Energy, Mines and Resources, or Jordan Owens with Cabinet Communication. As we've said before, we appreciate that many people have questions and concerns about the situation. We don't have all the answers at this point, but we are here to share what we do know. We are still working out the best approach to providing updates to the public and looking at different ways to provide more information online. For now, we will publish a recording of this briefing on Facebook. We are also regularly updating the yukon.ca online hub. I would now like to introduce the speakers and technical experts here today. There will be some introductory comments before opening the floor to questions. From the Department of Environment, we have Brendan Mulligan, a senior groundwater scientist, as well as Cameron Sinclair, a senior fisheries biologist. We also have Dr. Mary Vanderkoff, Yukon's Chief Veterinary Officer. Also joining from the Department of Health and Social Services are Benton Foster, Director of Community Health Programs, and Dr. Sidit Ranade, Chief Medical Officer of Health. We will start with Brendan Mulligan, Senior Groundwater Scientist. He will be giving us an update on off-site water quality monitoring and its results.
Thank you, and hello everyone. My name is Brendan Mulligan. I'm the Senior Groundwater Scientist with the Department of Environment's Water Resources Branch. In recent weeks, we've been discussing how groundwater has been transporting contaminants from the failed heap leach materials to receiving surface waters. Today, I'll expand on that topic before discussing a surface water discharge from the mine's water treatment plant. The heap leach pad failure that occurred on June 24, 2024 at the Eagle Gold Mine site resulted in the movement of ore from a lined pad to a relatively large unlined area. In this unlined area, some of the water previously contained by the liner was suddenly able to infiltrate the ground and contaminate the underlying groundwater. Although, for important safety reasons, we've not been able to regularly sample the on-site groundwater monitoring wells that are identified in our water monitoring and reporting plan, we have clear evidence that groundwater has been impacted by the failure. Victoria Gold Corp has been regularly sampling locations where groundwater daylights to surface in the vicinity of the Lower Dublin South Pond, or LDSP. Concentrations of weak acid dissociable, or WAD, cyanide at these locations are 10,000 times greater than the long-term water quality guidelines for the protection of aquatic life. Now, I want to emphasize that groundwater at these locations is being collected and contained on site. However, not all of the groundwater flowing down the Dublin Gulch and Eagle Creek valleys is captured. This is evident based on surface water samples collected from Dublin Gulch at monitoring station DG1. I'll point to that station on the map displayed here. WAD cyanide concentrations at DG1 have significantly exceeded guidelines for the protection of aquatic life on every sample collected by Yukon government at that location since July 18. These concentrations remained steady during the past week. We do not yet have evidence that impacted groundwater is discharging directly to Haggart Creek. So to summarize this portion of the water quality story, contaminants are transported from the heap leach failure via groundwater to Dublin Gulch, and then via surface water from Dublin Gulch to Haggart Creek. I now want to discuss the impacts to Haggart Creek from the surface water discharge from the mine's water treatment plant last week. Discharge from the mine's water treatment plant occurred on July 31st at 12:15 p.m. and ended on August 2nd at 12:30 a.m. Water Resources Branch was informed that the majority of the total volume discharged was released on August 1st. On August 1st, while Victoria Gold Corp was discharging from its water treatment plant to Haggart Creek, concentrations of WAD cyanide exceeded both chronic or long-term and acute or short-term guidelines for the protection of aquatic life and water quality objectives, or WQOs, at 3 stations on Haggart Creek. Those are W4 mix, W29, and W99. On the same day, concentrations of wad cyanide exceeded the chronic or long-term guideline for the protection of aquatic life and the WQO further downstream on Haggard Creek, at W23. Guidelines for the protection of aquatic life were not exceeded at stations further downstream, that is YT09DD0014 or W49, which is on the South McQuestion River, on August 1st. On August 2nd, after the discharge had ceased, concentrations of wad cyanide again exceeded both chronic or long-term and acute or short-term guidelines for the protection of aquatic life and the water quality objective at W99, and again exceeded the chronic or long-term guideline and water quality objective for the protection of aquatic life at W4 mix and W23. Our station furthest downstream on Haggard Creek, YT09DD0014 and W49, are sampled every other day and were not sampled on August 2nd. They were sampled on August 3rd, and we will share those water quality results when they're available next week. We only have partial water quality results from the laboratory for these recent dates. As more water quality data are received, we'll continue to share our findings and update our interpretations. The wad cyanide concentrations observed in Haggard Creek from W4 mix to W23 on August 1st and 2nd are several times higher than the concentrations observed in the previous week. Water quality results from samples collected in Haggard Creek during this period of discharge from the water treatment plant will be available at yukon.ca/victoria-gold-updates. In summary, I began by outlining how contaminants are transported from the heap leach failure via groundwater to Dublin Gulch, and via surface water then from Dublin Gulch to Haggard Creek. And this is a longer-term process. I then detailed the impacts to Haggard Creek from the surface water discharge from the mine's water treatment plant last week. The discharge took place over approximately a day and a half and stopped last week. Our team will continue to monitor both surface water and groundwater insofar as it is safe to do so, and we'll continue to share our results and interpretations as they become available. Cameron Sinclair will now discuss the implications of the water quality impacts that I have presented on fish in Haggard Creek.
Thanks, Brendan. My name is Cameron Sinclair. I'm the Senior Fisheries Biologist with the Department of Environment. So today I'm going to provide an update on the reported fish kill downstream of the Eagle Gold Mine. I want to start by providing some details of the incident, followed by actions taken and next steps, as well as how this affects our long-term monitoring program, which I've talked about in the last couple of weeks. So to start, Victoria Gold reported that on August 2nd, personnel discovered several dead fish in the Haggard Creek watershed, in Haggard Creek specifically. The map up there shows the locations. So as of now, we're aware of 68 dead fish that have been collected by the company, all of which were collected on August 2nd from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. These 68 fish consisted of Arctic grayling as well as some sculpin. Again, like I said, the locations there are shown on the map. To be clear, the dead fish that were observed this week are believed to be due to the discharge from the mine's water treatment plants and not directly due to the contaminants that we've been seeing in the receiving environment since the heap leach failure. When the company discovered the initial dead fish, they stated that they immediately ceased discharging water from the mine treatment plant. All of these fish were collected by the company to store for later analysis and are currently in the possession of Victoria Gold. So a fish kill of any activity other than fishing is prohibited under the Federal Fisheries Act, which is enforced jointly by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and Environment and Climate Change Canada. So now I want to talk about the actions and mitigations that were taken in response to this fish kill. So to start, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans was immediately made aware of the situation and ordered Victoria Gold to implement several mitigation efforts following this event. This is a legal order by the federal government that we are advised contains several mitigation efforts which we support. Primarily, and I'll go to the next map there, is this instructed Victoria Gold to construct a series of 7 fish barriers throughout Haggard Creek, which are shown on the map. And this work was ordered to be conducted last weekend. In addition to these barriers, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans ordered the company to salvage as many fish possible downstream from the area of number 2 and number 3 in the Haggard Creek. We've been advised that this work is underway and if not, already completed. The overarching goal is to prevent fish from moving into those areas that had that increased contamination, while moving fish out of the areas, essentially creating this no-go zone for fish. As you may imagine, blocking areas in the stream can disrupt fish migration patterns, can disrupt regular movement patterns, and where those salvaged fish are placed can also impact the downstream environments. That is why our team, along with close collaboration with the First Nation of Nacho-Naik-Dun, is working directly with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to provide recommendations for future orders to ensure that they simultaneously align with the objectives of this order, protecting fish from those contaminated areas, while also aligning with our joint long-term fisheries monitoring plan. So some of these recommendations include ensuring all salvaged fish are measured and enumerated by species, so we know what's been salvaged out of that area, as well as determining if any of those dead fish were implanted by the tags that we implanted over the last couple of weeks in close collaboration with the First Nation. The key here is that we want to ensure the integrity to protect fish while also ensuring the integrity to our ability to detect change over time as we do this program later in the future, next year, to see what the impacts of this spill has been. These are currently being reviewed. New orders may occur. However, they are, again, the mandate of the Federal Department of Fisheries and Oceans, where our mandate is to ensure sustainable populations, which this does have the potential to impact, this being the discharge. In addition to these actions, to respond to this incident, the Department of Environment is continuing to work very closely with the First Nation of Nacho-Naik-Dun to implement and modify our long-term monitoring plan. As we collect any more information on fish health in the area, we'll continue to provide regular updates. Until then, you can see all regular updates on yukon.ca.
Thank you, Cameron and Brendan. Next, we will have Dr. Mary Vanderkoff, Chief Veterinary Officer. She will speak more about the aquatic health and the ungulate monitoring plan.
Good morning. As you've heard, there were 68 dead fish that were retrieved from Haggard Creek on August 2nd, following the discharge of water from the mines treatment plant. The death of a large group of fish like that, of multiple species, in a really short period of time is completely consistent with what we would expect from cyanide toxicity. Cyanide at toxic levels, like those that exceed the acute or short-term guidelines for the protection of aquatic life, it kills fish really quickly. And it's also indiscriminate. So any species that come into contact with it, it's rapidly absorbed through the gills, and it interferes with the oxygen process and results essentially in rapid suffocation. It is, there are really few signs of illness in fish that might be affected by something like this. Essentially, they die very, very acutely. It's exceedingly challenging to confirm cyanide as the cause of death by testing the tissues of dead fish or animals after the fact. It breaks down really rapidly in those tissues after death, and especially in high environmental temperatures that we've experienced here in the last week or two. The good part about that, the difficult part about that is it makes it challenging for us to actually confirm this by testing tissues and detecting cyanide. The good part is that cyanide doesn't bioaccumulate. So animals or fish that die as a result of cyanide poisoning will not have levels of cyanide in their tissues or in their blood that would represent a threat to animals that might consume carcasses that weren't picked up. So we don't have a concern about this being something that is going to be an enduring problem within the environment, unless there are subsequent releases of high levels of cyanide sufficient to cause additional kills. This is something where those fish that maybe remain in the environment that may have died will decompose and will not represent a threat to the health of the other animals in the environment. This is a single event that apparently occurred. And apart from that, we remain interested in the long-term impacts of the heap leach failure. And again, in collaboration and in response to questions and concerns raised by National Done, we have initiated a surveillance program to look at specifically heavy metals that might be in increased amount in the environment associated with that heap leach failure and associated with what might occur into the future. There's been some work done in the past measuring heavy metals in moose and caribou in Yukon. And while some of these elements are normal and required for body function, there are many of them that in high levels can be toxic and can represent a problem going forward. At this time, there are no indications that any animals harvested in the region of this heap leach failure would be a problem for consumption. There are no indications. When we talk about heavy metals, we're talking about accumulation over years, not weeks or months. But at the same time, it is really important for us to have baseline levels for comparison in the event of a failure like this that might result in introduction of these compounds into the environment. So what we have done is, in order to support the testing for these metals, is put out a request to those who will be harvesting in the game management subzones that are north of Mayo to collect samples for us to test for a variety of heavy metals. Consists of a suite of about 35 of those, and we'll be asking for kidney, liver, skeletal muscle, as well as the incisor bar, which is the lower bar of the lower jaw that holds the teeth. That's important because we use that for aging of the animals. As these metals accumulate over time, over the lifetime of an animal, it's important for us to know if the metal levels are from a 2-year-old or from a 12-year-old moose. We're asking that folks will freeze those samples. They can pick up the sample collection kits from the offices of Natural Done as well as from our Environment District offices and submit those to us. I do want to emphasize that what we are not doing is testing tissues from an individual animal to state whether that animal is safe to consume. The testing that we're doing is part of an overall surveillance program, and we have no indications that there is any impact of this on the safety of animals that are harvested for consumption. So the details with the list of those subzones, as well as details about the sampling and the surveillance, will be available, like everything else, on that yukon.ca portal related to this incident.
Thank you, Mary. I will now pass it to Dr. Sudit Ranade, Chief Medical Officer of Health, to also provide some remarks.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. You've heard from our colleagues, and there's just a couple of things that I wanted to make sure that we're all clear on. So when you hear our colleagues talking about contamination of the groundwater on site, I don't want that to be interpreted or misinterpreted as the possibility for contamination of the groundwater related to the drinking water system. These are separate systems, and so at this time, the drinking water system that is regulated is still not at risk, and so that is not a concern at this moment. With respect to hunting and fishing, you have heard about the recent baseline monitoring program that's been instituted, but there's no change in the recommendation to hunting in the area in terms of consumption of the meat. And in terms of fishing, we've just posted the signs, as you've said, as you know by now, and so it's just the areas that are posted in which there are recommendations related to recreational water use and fish consumption. And then finally, I want to sort of preview something that, as you see data and numbers from the zones where water is being sampled, as you see, for example, cyanide creeping upwards towards the drinking water guideline, it's reasonable to question, like, well, what impact will that have on drinking water, or when would that change a recommendation? So, at the point at which the source water reaches the drinking water guideline, that doesn't immediately mean that we would change the guidance around recreational water use downstream, and there's two reasons for that. One reason is the significant amount of dilution that happens between the source and the downstream places where people are using the water. And the second is the amount of exposure that you get from incidental water consumption or from recreating in the water, which is essentially boating, swimming, and etc., is nowhere near the kind of exposure that you get from a primary drinking water source, right? And so when we talk about recreational water exposures, we're talking about usually a lower level of overall exposure and different types of exposure like dermal exposures, which actually require a much higher load than ingestion exposures to create an effect in the body. And this is specific to cyanide. So other metals behave and other substances behave in different ways, but because cyanide is the topic of sort of active discussion right now, I just wanted to clarify that. So when you see those numbers go up on site, and if they meet or exceed the drinking water standards, that does not mean that we will immediately change recommendations around recreational water use. I hope I've explained why that is, but we can talk about that if you need to. Beyond that, everything that I have said just now remains contingent upon what is actually happening on the site and any changes to that. And so as things change, this is a dynamic situation, we continue to monitor with our colleagues, and we will continue to advise on human health related risks as a consequence of the incident and the unfolding events that are at the mine site.
Thank you, Sudit, and everyone for your updates. We will now open the floor to questions. We will give each reporter one question and one follow-up. Since we've had a lot of information covered today, I do ask that you keep your questions concise, and I will also ask that you identify who your question is directed to. We'll begin with reporters in the room and then turn to reporters joining remotely. Please indicate in the chat if you have a question to ask. We'll start with Macklin from CKRW.
I'm not sure who's best for this question, but it was really just to clarify something. I think it was mentioned that there might not be lingering effects. Can someone elaborate on how that works? Because I understand there was a whole 3 days worth of cyanide potentially surface water pumped into Haggart Creek. So why, I guess, will there be lingering contamination?
Okay. Yeah, thanks for the question. So as you know, there's a lag between when we sample water and get results from the laboratory. And currently I'm sharing results up to August 2nd, right? I don't have results available for samples collected more recently than then. When those results are available, we'll share them. So on August 2nd, which is the day after the discharge, because the discharge ceased at 12:30 a.m. on that day. The samples were collected later that day, and we still saw exceedances of guidelines for the protection of aquatic life as far downstream as W23. We don't yet have results for later dates, as I said, and we'll share them when they are available. But we have to remember the discharge only took place for about a day and a half, and Haggart Creek is flowing, right? So over time, it's advancing, and it's going to essentially flush contaminants that were input in a short duration. So I don't know if my colleagues want to add anything about how this sort of pulse might affect fish health.
Yeah, so for fisheries, for any sort of lingering effects, it really sort of ties into our longer term, both short term and longer term monitoring. And is there more fish kill found sort of down below the barriers, which is really goes back to any death of fish is the responsibility of the company. And the idea of those mitigation measures to move fish out of that high area where they saw that fish kill and into the lower one, and also preventing upstream movement. And the goal there is to really limit any lingering effects. And the two lingering effects would be short-term, is there another fish kill that would be more downstream, which would be observed, or that longer term, what's the lingering effects on the population, which is hopefully what we can answer with that long-term sort of population and movement question, which is why it's really important to determine if those fish had some tags in it, so we can determine the mark recapture abundance of it, or and the tag loss from that area, and to see where those fish are going. So that question will hopefully be answered in the long term, really.
And just to add, cyanide as a chemical does break down in the environment to its component parts, and it breaks down when exposed to air. So turbulent water flows and abundant water flows will not only dilute whatever was introduced, but will also contribute to the breakdown of that chemical. Some of those component parts may not be so nice either. And so there, it's not innocuous, but there is that factor that's part of all of this.
Do you have a follow-up? No. Sarah from Radio Canada.
Hi, do we know what went wrong with the water that was discharged? Was it supposed to be that way, or has it been a problem with the water treatment? How come it caused that effect?
Yeah, so I'm here to speak about impacts on the receiving environment. So I think questions concerning treatment or the discharge specifically should be directed to the Department of Energy, Mines and Resources.
Do you have a follow-up?
Just double checking, we still don't have access to the groundwater. Do we have a timeline on when we'll have access to that?
I don't have that information yet. We're essentially waiting for any modification to the exclusion zone, at which time we'll sample as per our plan. But at this time, we're still prohibited from working in that area.
Thank you. Sarah from APTN.
Hi, you might have said this before, but just so I'm clear, do you have any more concerns more fish might die?
Yeah, so the concerns for that, I guess, would be there's two incidents happening. There's that short-term, whether you call it a pulse or whatever came from the discharge that had that high level of cyanide. Like I said, that we don't have many concerns right now, although we're still sort of monitoring for that, because essentially that sort of pulse or whatever you want to call it is flowed down and it's had its effect. Then there's do we have any sort of concern over time of the actual heap leach failure, which is that primary event. And what we've seen from the water quality over the last couple of weeks before this happened was an increasing, and Brendan can correct me if I'm wrong, levels of cyanide in Haggard Creek and going downstream. And we're still concerned about that because we aren't quite sure where that will top out. And we want to make sure that doesn't get to that level that will kill fish. But that's why we're there monitoring, because if we didn't have a concern, we wouldn't be sitting here and having a monitoring program. So yes, we are, and hopefully the monitoring program can determine when if that happens, and then what the effect of that is.
Do you have a follow-up?
And I'm also just wondering, do you think the fish barriers being built by Vic are enough to protect the fish, or maybe does more need to be done?
Yeah, good question. In general, or sort of overarching, fish barriers can be effective if they're preventing fish from getting in and out of the area. That assumes that you can collect every fish that's in that area. And fish salvages are designed to catch as many as possible. But they're not 100% effective all the time, because one fish may skirt around you or whatever have it. So it is a highly effective tool, like all sort of tools like that, not 100%, but it is really designed to do that and to do the most protection as possible. So from that aspect of blocking upward and downward migration, yes, but there's still discussions right now with us and the First Nation of Natchitoches Dun and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans of what triggers the removal of that. Because we're going to get into the fall, Arctic grayling are going to want to get out of those high areas and downstream into the regular environments. So is there more fish salvages to come? Do the barriers get removed? It's all going to have to tie into the water quality levels at that time, but we do have a time limit of winter is coming, and what do we do with those fish before they sort of start moving into their winter habitats?
Jackie from CBC.
Hi, I think this is for like the fish and water folks. Kind of just, you mentioned a little bit of this in the answer to Sarah's question, but for the average non-scientist, they're hearing about huge amounts of cyanide in the water, elevated levels, 68 dead fish. Just in plain English, can you break it down? Like, how worried should the average Yukoner be about this, and how worried are you about those findings? And what does this mean in bigger picture?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think from a water quality perspective, I guess the way that we communicate concern, if you want to call it that, is in reference to relevant benchmark concentrations, right? So if we're not seeing cyanide above guidelines for the protection of aquatic life, then I think it's fair to say that we're not concerned. If we see concentrations in the environment that exceed those guidelines, then we share that information with people like Cameron to help us interpret what effect that might have on aquatic life. When we see exceedances of the chronic guidelines, those are longer term, so those have to persist for some time, likely before there's effects, and I'll let Cameron expand on that if you'd like to. When we see exceedances of the acute guidelines, those are higher thresholds with the potential for effects in shorter time frames. So I'd say our way of communicating concern is by sharing our results in reference to these guidelines, and then having biologists help us interpret what that means for fish specifically.
Yeah, and sort of for the average Yukoner, like what your question is, what's the main concern here? I'd say, again, probably twofold. There's the concern of this event that happened that killed 68 fish, and like Mary was saying, that cyanide degrades and doesn't bioaccumulate. There's no immediate concern for general Yukoners there, and then there's the concern for that initial event and the heap leach failure itself. I think there's definitely a concern with cyanide being put into water where it shouldn't be. So that's clearly a concern for Yukoners, because that's not natural to the environment. And hopefully, with sort of a lot of these joint programs, we can provide that information to know what the degree of that concern is, whether it's just a very close to the Hager Creek, or if it becomes something larger. And the hope is the way it degrades and sort of dilution of it, this will be an isolated incident within that watershed. How far it spreads throughout that watershed, we're still working to figure out, if that answered your question.
Do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, this is kind of around enforcement, and I know DFO is the one issuing legal orders in this case, but it's a legal order, but to my understanding, the consequences of not following are a monetary fine, and we know the company doesn't have a ton of cash, and the cash it does have is presumably going into all the work that's happening on site. So are we in kind of a catch-22 here in terms of enforcement and actually ensuring all of this work is done, and what happens when the work isn't done?
That question's out of the scope of the individuals with us today. You can follow up with me after, and we can try and find the right person to. We'll go to Stuart from Shown FM.
This question's probably for Cameron Sinclair. 68 dead fish. They were Arctic grayling and sculpin. How many of each?
Yeah, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but we can get that back to you for sure, what we've been given from Victoria Golds. So I couldn't elaborate now because I don't have it, but we can get that.
So we'll go to those online. We'll start with Blair from the Northern Miner.
Hello, yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. You've talked about cyanide and also heavy metals that have been released from the heap leach failure. Just what are we talking in terms of how much heavy metals have entered the groundwater? Do you have any estimate or any number on that?
That's a good question. As we've emphasized a couple times, we've not been able to sample most of the groundwater monitoring wells in our sampling plan because they're in the exclusion zone, so it's not safe to do so. We are monitoring metal concentrations in surface water, and those data are lagging even more than the cyanide data. So we don't have the most recent metals data available for me to elaborate on now. For the metals data we have received in surface water, we haven't seen exceedances of guideline that we attribute to the heap leach failure. The There is information about the metals content of solution on site, and some of the groundwater I mentioned that's collected and captured on site. But with those on site matters, I'll defer to the Department of Energy, Mines and Resources to answer questions about that.
Do you have a follow-up?
Yes, and it was mentioned earlier also that cyanide doesn't linger in the environment, that it kills fast and whatnot. However, heavy metals might linger a bit longer. This might sound similar to a previous question that was asked, but from the perspective of the average person, what should Yukoners be more worried about in this situation? Lingering heavy metals or cyanide contamination?
Maybe I can start, and then so I'll just start by reiterating that we haven't seen in surface waters draining the site concerning concentrations of metals to date. I mentioned there's a lag in the data, so I don't have the latest results to share with you today. But with the results available, we haven't seen concerning concentrations of metals in surface water. We have seen levels of concern of cyanide, which I have shared with you. We haven't seen exceedances of relevant guidelines for the protection of aquatic life past that station I referenced, W23 on Haggard Creek. So we have some indication, at least preliminarily, of the extent of those impacts. So yeah, there's a bit of a response from a water quality perspective. I don't know if others want to weigh in as well.
I think immediate concern, the event that occurred caused the immediate concern around cyanide, and that event is past. Provided there aren't additional discharges of a comparable material, then we wouldn't have concern with exceedances that would contribute to an acute toxic event. The concern over heavy metals is more long-standing, and I think it's something that arises anytime there's activity that might increase those. So our response is simply to say it's useful for us to have additional information about those baseline levels, and it's useful for us to be aware of the fact that those metals can accumulate over the lifetime of animals that may be harvested. And if there is an increase in the amount that is being more readily available in the environment as a result of the heap leach failure, then we would like to be prepared in advance to have those baseline levels that we can monitor. Are we actively extremely concerned about that? No. But do we bear that in mind when we think about the safety of animals and the impacts on the ecosystem of activities? Yes, we are.
We'll go to Daryl from Canadian Press.
Hello, I believe my question would be best answered by Mr. Mulligan. When you talk about 10,000 times exceeding these guidelines, are these the kind of results that are to be expected after a discharge like that, or is that perhaps alarmingly higher than could be hypothesized?
Yeah, it's a good question. I do want to re-emphasize that those concentrations are found in waters that are collected and contained on site. And the guidelines don't apply there. The guidelines apply for the protection of aquatic life in the receiving environment. But I'm using the guidelines there as a reference point to communicate the magnitude of concentrations found in those waters. We know from analysis of the solution in the heap approximately what concentrations are to be expected there, and so there's sort of a maximum available. And I think, yeah, what we've seen there is in line with that.
So this discharge event, did it go wrong? Is it something like that went wrong and all these fish died, or was this, something that the company and that the government and that the DFO all knew was going to happen? I'm just wondering, whether or not this was like a surprising result of this discharge.
Thanks for the question. That is out of the scope of the individuals with us today. We'll follow up with you and I can direct your question to the correct individual. We'll go to Jim with Yukon News.
Yes, thank you. I'm being heard here. Hello, am I coming through?
Yep.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Just like I understand that it might not be the individuals at this table making the decision to put this in place. But like does the technology exist to test the water coming out of the water treatment facility prior to discharge?
So unfortunately, we don't have that question or anybody to answer that question. Do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I guess I do. Just returning to questions about salmon last week, when I understand that the territorial government biologists were going to be engaging with Department of Fisheries and Oceans to try to learn more about how they use Haggard Creek. Is anything more known that you can share?
Not a whole bunch, Jim, but the DFO and the First Nation Natchel were doing some flights, I believe, earlier this week as the salmon are spawning up there to see if they could spot any. I don't have any of the results on that, but we can check in on that for sure. So, but no, there's nothing additional from last week on that.
Thank you. So we have a bit of time. We'll have any more questions. Is there anybody in the room that has another question? Sarah?
It's again about the fish. Just to make sure, like, if I understand correctly, as of right now, all these 68 fish that were found dead are being retained by Victoria Gold. Is there any plan to get some back to do our own samplings, or we just have to trust Victoria Gold on that one?
Yeah, so right now we're in talks with both Fisheries and Oceans Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada because they would take the lead role in any sort of investigation. So we're asking them if they need those fish for any investigative purposes first. When we get that answer, we'll know if they're going to take them or not. And then if they do or don't, we're still interested in taking them for getting lengths, getting weights, and scanning them for any sort of tags, like I was talking about before. So hopefully we'll find out that information today or tomorrow.
Do you have a follow-up? Is anybody else in the Stuart?
Sort of following on that a little bit was, I know that fish samples were being taken from fish early on in the process. Have samples been taken from these 68 fish that were found last week? Are those being sent off to a lab?
Right now, they're just in possession with Victoria Gold, and we heard that they're being frozen. So no samples have been taken that I'm aware of.
Do you have a follow-up?
Has Victoria Gold given any indication why they haven't collected samples from these fish yet?
So that question would be best directed to Victoria Gold. Jackie?
I think this might be for everyone, but just going back to the average person who's not a scientist or a medical professional, you hear cyanide, you hear dead fish, and there's been a lot of dialogue around the impacts. Do you think some of the concern that's been raised, like just based with your expert knowledge, are people overreacting to what's happening?
I think it's really hard to say, to make a judgment about people's reactions, right? It's very personal in terms of how people take things. At this point, this is a localized incident, and all components of it are localized to an area. I think there's a legitimate concern on the part of folks who are in that area. I think broader concerns are, again, it's hard for us to say, is that okay or not okay? People's reactions are what they will be. We're trying to stay on top of the information and share that information as soon as it becomes available to us. And I think that's what alleviates some of those concerns, is that transparency that we're striving for.
I'll just add to that. Like I can just speak to the reaction of our branch to the incident, and what our branch has done is collaborate with the First Nation of Nacho Dun, partners across Yukon government, partners with the federal government, third-party consultants hired to support us, excuse me, to design and implement a water monitoring and reporting plan. And I think that reaction is entirely appropriate. It's a very significant reaction. It's caused a lot of the staff in our branch to focus enormous amounts of energy on this file. And then once we have our results, what we try to do is communicate them as clearly as possible, explaining the magnitude and the extent of the impacts so that the average Yukoner can scale their reaction appropriately, right? So I'm trying to make clear how far downstream have we seen exceedances, what are the magnitude of those. I think the doctor Chief Medical Officer of Health has explained how, the regulated water system in Mayo is not going to be affected by this. It's not linked. So that's a concern that we can put to rest. But I'm trying to communicate the water quality information in a way that people can decide how to scale their concerns.
Any other questions? So with that, that is all what we have time for today. If we weren't able to answer one of your questions, please let me know and we'll do our best to follow up. I would also like to remind folks that Yukoners can access information about the Eagle Gold Mine heap leach failure at yukon.ca/Victoria-gold-updates or on yukon.ca/FR/Victoria-mise-a-jour. We'll be posting updated information as it becomes available. Thank you to our speakers, technical experts, and everyone who joined us today, and have a wonderful rest of your day.